Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to the Redefining HR Fireside Chat series. This is event number 2, and I'm thrilled to be joined by my friend, Darren Murph. Darren's a lot of things, but Darren's the head of remote for GitLab, probably one of the most in-demand people in all of the people space over the last year. He's an author, he's a dad, he's a journalist, he's got world records. Darren's got a lot going on. So I'm really excited to jump into this conversation with him. You know, one of the interesting things about writing Redefining HR last year, writing a book during a pandemic is its own interesting thing. But really what was kind of fortuitous about it for me was, I'm writing this in March, April, May, June, when all of the things were happening, all of the things that are all 2020, were happening. And so I was able to account for those in the book. But one of the things that was really important for me to cover in the book was this transition to remote and distributed work. And so, Darren was gracious enough to come on the Redefining HR podcast, have a conversation around all things remote and distributed. We've stayed in touch since. I'm a huge fan of not just his work, but really his approach and his mindset, particularly as it relates to working out loud and open source practices. I think if you're watching this, chances are you've probably downloaded some of GitLab's distributed work resources and tools to help guide your own organization through the shift to remote, distributed, hybrid, all of that. So we've got a lot to cover. As a reminder, this is an interactive session, so I have lots of questions for Darren. I'm not going to hog him. I want to give you all the opportunity to ask questions. So I'm going to open up with a few questions, and then I'm going to be, if you wouldn't mind, because it's hard to talk and keep my eyes on a chat stream at the same time. So I will tee up when we're ready to make it interactive with questions. And then if you have questions for Darren, just add them to the chat window then. And then that way I can be sure that I catch them. And we'll cover as many as we can in the hour we have together. So, Darren, I'm going to shut up, man. How are you? How is your world? Like I said, since last year, you've been the most in-demand person in HR. What is that like for you? Give everybody just, I think most viewers probably know you, know your background, but just share a little bit about what your world is like these days.
Yeah, thanks, first of all, for having me, Lars. Thanks all for tuning in and joining and being gracious with your time. My world has been quite wild. I think everyone's world has been a bit wild, but being in a space where I'm essentially pioneering and defining the head of remote role, the concept of a dedicated, intentional leader within a remote organization is fascinating. History is being written under my feet, and it is quite the privilege to have the opportunity and the platform to be a part of how that history is written.
Yeah. And so let's kind of dig right in. Last year we had, if you look at the evolution of remote and distributed work, I think it was obviously, it was happening before 2020. It was happening in pockets. You had some companies that were entirely distributed from the start. You had others that had more of a hybrid model. 2020 came along and crushed all of us, pushed everybody into, for those of us who had employees who had the ability to work remote, an entirely remote model. Many of us, around the world are still operating in that model. Like when you look across the landscape of remote, distributed, hybrid work today, how do you summarize that? Like how do you describe the state of remote today?
Companies are still trying to figure out what this is and what this looks like, how their culture will evolve, and grappling with the reality that to do this well, you're going to have to audit every single process and workflow and retool it for a new reality. It's jarring. I think a lot of organizations spent the last year trying to ignore that reality. And as we enter in 2021, you're feeling that this reckoning where this actually isn't going away. We'll never fully put this genie back in the bottle. And to your point, a movement that was already underway has now been massively accelerated. You just look at technology, it moved from on-premise into the cloud, and it took us a while to wrap our heads around that. Essentially, people operations and organizational design is now shifting from on-premise into the cloud. And so what does organizational design look like when people are effectively in the cloud? And it's a deep question. And it's as much about psychology as it is the tools that make it possible.
And so let's talk about that a little bit, because you're right. I think in 2020, we all shifted to remote at scale. We flirted with the idea of return to work strategies, blissfully naively, in Q3, that we realized that wasn't going to happen. And, now here we are for many of us coming up on the 1-year anniversary of this shift. And, we still don't know what, if, and how office life will look like. So what do you, when you think about where most companies are right now, where they're realizing that this is not a short-term phenomenon, and it's still, lots of signs and hope around vaccines and things like that, but we still don't know when we're going to get back in an office and who is going to be back in an office. So what do you think are some of the biggest challenges that I guess both companies and HR leaders are faced with right now as they're trying to, have a bit of planning and kind of foresight into how they're going to be structured?
And we actually have been working on a report at GitLab that we've lovingly entitled Out of the Office. And it actually just this week. And we interviewed hundreds of people midway through the pandemic and then through it, tried to get an understanding of how their life is changing, what's good about it, what's bad about it. And we've made this available free of charge and open sourced it so that people leaders around the world can get some insights to make decisions on. One of the core things that people leaders need to understand is that the global conversation about when do we return to the office is actually the wrong one. This is not the end of the office. It's the end of the office mentality. At its core, what we're walking into is a much more democratized and inclusive and flexible way of working. And the power has massively shifted to the people, away from the typical epicenters of power at the top of corporations. So what I'm encouraging people leaders is to focus on retooling all of your practices to be remote first. This is the key challenge. If you retool your meetings and your asynchronous workflows and even your culture to work when no one is in the office, it also works when everyone is in the office. But the same is not true in reverse. If you still handle meetings and communications and culture rooted in co-location, if it requires the office to work, then it won't work if any subset of your company is outside of the office. So understanding that and taking a look at every single practice and retooling it to be remote first is the key challenge. The office is in large part a distraction. It's really about the workflows. And if you make those work anywhere, then they also work in the office if you choose to show back up there.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great point. And I think it's something that, for most HR practitioners, right, when COVID hit, we all moved to remote. We essentially ported all of our, organizational operating systems and rhythms to just doing it remotely. They weren't designed for remote. They were designed for co-location, and we were just, MacGyvering them to fit in an environment where we weren't in an office. Now that we know that this isn't a short-term phenomenon, I think it's companies are starting to now think about, more thoughtfully around how they can re-engineer that. And I think, you raised a really good point around make remote first your default, because then it's the same playing field for all organizations. And so, in doing that, what are some of the key components or things that need to be changed that were, maybe dogmatic views in co-location that really have to be re-engineered to truly be remote first? Like, are there particular aspects of organizational habits and rituals and rhythms that are the most important to re-engineer?
Yeah, so I'm going to get a bit in the weeds on the psychology first, and then more directly answer that. So first of all, I want to talk about what not to do. So many people are asking themselves right now, what do we do? What do we add to an already chaotic environment to make things better? Like, hold on, just say that out loud. We don't really need another thing to add on top of all we're doing. So I prefer the subtractive approach to success. what can we take away to more easily pave the way for success being more seamless? And for those watching live, I will chat a GitLab handbook page on what not to do in this transition. So to give you some perspective here, many organizations are in what I call phase one of remote adaptation. It's the shift and lift, the skeuomorphic approach. Yeah. They've shifted out of the office rapidly into a virtual world, but they're copy and pasting everything. So all of the meetings they used to have, they simply have them in Zoom now. They never actually pause to think, is this recurring meeting still useful? Should we change our meeting hygiene? Is anyone documenting this? Nothing actually changed about the practice, only the playing field in which it was happening. Yeah. When you get to a point where you are intentional about asynchronous communication, moving work forward without the need for two people or more to be online at the exact same time, that is the telltale sign that you have evolved past shift and lift and you're moving in the right direction. So that is the North Star. And so what not to do is anything that would distract from that. I will say one thing that you could focus on immediately is meetings. Yeah. Why? Because everyone has them. It will impact everyone from the intern all the way to the CEO. And they tend to show the best and worst of organizations. The hygiene, the real ways of working really show up in a meeting. And so if you actively work on ways to make meetings higher friction so that people will have less of them, and instead they will write things down in more public forums, you're well on your way to unlocking the potential that awaits, and also making people realize that there's a new way to do things. We don't always have to default to synchronicity in a meeting to get things done.
Yeah. One of the things I'm curious to get your perspective on, like I know, for GitLab, one of the keys to your success in building and scaling a fully distributed work has been documentation. Like you said, writing things down, having notes on everything, right? Having guidance for any employee who maybe has been there for a while or somebody who just joins on how to basically do pretty much anything that their role will involve. What do you over time, I can imagine the volume and density of that documentation becomes massive and, potentially unwieldy. Like, how do you manage that internally so that from a UX perspective and a use perspective, employees can, more easily find what they need when they need it? Yeah.
If I asked you, is there too much information on the internet? You would probably say, no, because I understand how to use Google.
Yeah.
The same is true with a company handbook, with scaling company-wide documentation. It's a distraction to focus on how much information is there. The two things that matter is, are we looking at a single source of truth? Or do I not really trust the documentation? Could there be documentation silos where something's copied over here and a fresher copy is over here? We've all seen the episodes of The Office where it's like _final, final. Final. We don't want to get in that nightmare. Yeah. So number one, you have to trust that you have a single source of truth and that is the ultimate endpoint on, is something relevant or new? And the second part is you have to teach people to self-service and search. You have to create the culture where people will not default to tapping someone on the shoulder to get information. They will default to searching and finding things on their own. And then only when they cannot find things do they then turn to a human who, by the way, needs to provide the answer and document it so that anyone who has this question henceforth won't have to ask a person. This is the concept of paying it forward. At GitLab, we actually try to answer everything with a link. And I know a lot of people are saying this is utopian. It's not realistic for my company, but not so fast. I've worked with a company that had no company handbook a year ago and were actively anti-remote in their hiring. And in 2021, they made built-in's list of best remote first places to work. And they have a multi-100-page handbook that's growing by the day. They literally started with a blinking cursor less than a year ago. And now they have hundreds of pages. It started somewhere and they continued to iterate and continued to iterate. It is possible. And this is a 6,000 or 7,000 person global operation. So I've seen it happen, and it gives me faith that companies that actually invest in it and make it a priority can see the same results.
Yeah, and I think that's got to be encouraging for viewers who, because that probably describes a lot of companies out there, right? An aversion to remote, lack of documentation, and the idea of that shift seems probably like such a Herculean task to them that actually it sounds like it's more attainable than they think. Let's kind of I could piggyback from that on technology. You obviously you've been working and you've been a leading champion of remote distributed work for years and years. You've seen lots of technology. You've seen technology come and go. Like, what is your optimal distributed work tech stack that you think people should look into as they're making more kind of permanent shifts to, at a very minimum, hybrid work, if not fully distributed work?
I put together this like starter guide tech stack. So I'll dive into that first, and then I want to touch on another point that layers on top of this. GetKona is an amazing tool for understanding EQ in remote teams. It essentially helps build a README or an operating manual for each employee in your organization, so that if they ping someone else on Slack, there's this nice drop down on, are you red, yellow, green today? How many meetings have you already been on today? Are you out with family? Is today really not a great day for something that's not urgent? Just useful technology to leverage a peek into how is this person doing today. I've been advising this company for a while, and I'm really encouraged by how they're using technology to make work more human. And I think that's really awesome. Yak is a really fun tool for asynchronous voice chats. It's a great way to get away from meetings. Loom is essentially the video version of that. Loom is an awesome tool for just sharing bite-sized clips of video. And instead of asking people to commit 30 minutes of their time, you just do a 5-minute video, share it publicly, and then people can respond through that. At GitLab, we're blessed to use GitLab for all of our project collaboration. So if you have access to GitLab, I would definitely encourage you to use that. We use it beyond software engineering. It is a tool for software engineering, but we use it for all of our transparent collaboration across the entire company. And if you want to lean into a tool to start your handbook, Almanac is a great place for that. The crucial element of Almanac, when you're looking across the sea of handbook tools, is that it supports merge request functionality. So it enables everyone in your organization to contribute a change to the handbook. And then the ultimate maintainer or directly responsible individual is able to look at that, edit that, change that, and then merge it into reality. So it kind of calms the chaos on how people are contributing. So that's the tooling part of it. But here's the culture part of it. You may be using some tools right now that will work. You just have to use them in a different, more innovative way. So case in point is GitLab uses Slack. A lot of teams around the world either use Microsoft Teams or Slack, but we use it in a very unconventional way. We expire all of our Slack messages after 90 days. So why do we do that? Because we want it to serve as a forcing function to not do work in Slack. We want work to happen in GitLab, which is a much more transparent place to work. So if you delete everyone's work after 90 days, it only takes 1 or 2 oopsies to shape the default and do work in GitLab. But there's a secondary benefit here too, which is Slack is an anxiety-inducing tool for many people. It is the bane of many's mental health issues. But if you really only use it for informal communication, parenting channels or hiking or cooking or fitness or music making, it's a much better place to hang out, because you know the work is happening over here, so we can use Slack to build relationships and build rapport, and that's a much better way to use it. So instead of using a new chat tool, just use the existing one in a new way. Google Docs is another great example. We attach a Google Doc to all of our work-related meetings so that it forces us to have temporal documentation. And if you're trying to think what happened in that one meeting, you just search your calendar for the meeting name, you find that meeting from 2 years ago, and voila, the Google Doc is attached to it. So simple things, using simple tools in new ways to encourage transparency, it goes a long way.
Yeah. Those are some great tips. And for those of you that are watching the recorded version of this video, I will include links to everything we're talking about in the show description and notes, so you can get access to those. But great tips and some tools that were not on my radar. So thanks for teaching me something new as you always do. So let's I want to open up some questions from the audience right now and make this a little interactive. So quick reminder for those of you in the chat function watching live, if you've already asked a question, I've definitely missed it. So please ask your questions again, and we'll cover as many of these as we can. I want to open with one that was sent in from Ciara Lacani. She's the Chief People Officer at Dashlane. And her question was, is there anything that you're doing differently kind of now in you know, we're not post-pandemic yet, but kind of mid-pandemic than you were pre-pandemic as it relates to remote work, I should say?
Yeah. So early on in the pandemic, we saw productivity going up and the amount of time taking off going down. And not a good recipe. That is basically the path to burnout. So we implemented what we're calling Family and Friends Day. And so we're taking a Friday off every single month, but not just taking it off. We built a corresponding Slack channel, Family and Friends Day, where we encourage people to share videos and photos and stories of doing anything not work. Maybe we can't go on elaborate trips, but you can hang out on your front porch and dust off an old book that you've been meaning to read, or call your parents, or something simple, just something other than work. And it's this awesome kind of breath of fresh air to have those on the calendar and just remember that we're all human, and culture looks a little different right now. It's more about being there for each other and a little less about company rah-rah. And the long-term benefit of that will be if we can maintain what we have here and be there for each other, we're going to have a lot to celebrate on the other side of that. And I'll say that we've just become a lot more, we recognize more that empathy matters now more than ever. At GitLab, we have no offices. So we rely really heavily on these key moments throughout the year for in-person engagements. Look, we're humans, we're communal, relational beings. In-person matters a lot. So our usual series of user events around the world, our usual company gathering where we get every employee together in one spot for a week of bonding, we couldn't do any of that in 2020. And you see the social reservoir start to dip, even for people that love remote work. We still love seeing each other. So we're trying to make IOUs on when we're going to get back together again. There's a lot of just hang on and get through it together that has to happen. But giving voice to it and recognizing that goes a long way.
Next question we have here is from Zoltan. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. The question is, how do you see that immersive tech will impact remote working and digital collaboration?
I think the potential here is huge. The folks at remote.com had this awesome pilot week where they gave everyone a Quest headset. And they did this experimentation of collaborating and hanging out and building culture with AR and VR integrated into the week. And I would say, check out their website. They have this awesome recap on what they learned in that. I don't think it will be the last. A lot of companies are looking into this, and I think it's amazing. It's time to get over the foosball tables and look to what's next. How do we give people more opportunities to plug in? But the thing I would advise people leaders on this is think really big, but also think really inclusively. Some people are going to love remote work specifically because they don't want the gimmicks. Remote work gives your introverts an amazing opportunity to contribute in the proverbial same size font as the usual loudest voices in the room. So if you are a natural extrovert, just put that in check. Not everyone wants a calendar full of virtual happy hours. At GitLab, we have a sub-value that allows us to shift our working hours for a cause. And I've encouraged some people leaders who are growing frustrated with one virtual happy hour after another. I say, if you want people to cut out early on a Friday, give everyone an hour to just put on a mask and go to Habitat for Humanity or a food bank or a community center, somewhere local that matters to them. And when you think about hundreds or thousands of people, each contributing that 1 hour on a Friday to something that matters to them, and then they all bring those stories back to work on Monday, that's the kind of water cooler conversation you really want to cultivate. And what we've seen as a global organization is many of us feel tighter and more bonded with our colleagues than in any prior org. And many of us have never met in person.
Yeah.
You have to create that culture, that psychological safety, to let people go build the culture outside of work and then bring it back to work.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think on the immersive tech piece, I did last year, I participated in a conference called Virtual HR Summit, and it was an all VR HR conference. And it was really interesting. Like I've played with VR before. Like I dug the technology. I wasn't quite sure how it would feel as a conference, but it felt way more familiar as somebody who goes to a lot of conferences than I expected it would, right? Like you're there, you're virtually walking around, you're talking to people. It was a pretty interesting experience. Obviously, there's a hardware barrier to entry to do that at scale. But I'm also pretty bullish on the ability to create opportunities to bring people together in that kind of immersive environment. So it'll be interesting. I think it's very much a watch this space sector as it continues to grow. Getting a few more questions from the attendees here. This next one is from Diana. She's asking, she's curious about how GitLab approaches employees who may struggle working from home during COVID in particular, either with caregiving, small living spaces, children, etc. How are they supported, and are they not brought on as part of the recruiting process?
Yeah, so this is a huge struggle for every company, and I want to acknowledge something up front. What we are dealing with right now is not remote work.
Yeah.
Forced into work from home. Yeah. I love remote work. Okay. I've been a remote worker for over 15 years. I'm an advocate for it. I'm a champion for it. But I also am a Delta million miler. I fly over 100,000 miles a year, and I have been forced to work from home for the past year. I've been unable to work remotely for the past year. And there's a big difference, especially for people who optimized their home or living space not for being there 24 hours a day. They assumed that they would be able to go do the bulk of their day and their work at a different space. So if you're forced back into that, maybe with subpar broadband, or now you have a spouse at home or multiple kids, it is not an ideal workspace. And at GitLab, we actually recognize and acknowledge that not everyone wants to work from home. Maybe you do on some days, but not on other days. And so we have a policy that we will allow people to submit expense reports, and we will reimburse for external co-working spaces or places like Cody or Switchyards. And we have about 1 in 5 GitLab employees that take us up on that on any given day during a month. But during COVID, that's a lot more difficult. A lot of our people that used to work that way have been forced back into their homes, and they weren't really looking forward to that. So how do we support them? Family and Friends Day was a big one. We've added some additional resources in our mental health handbook page, which I've linked there as well. And we've just been very open and transparent about redistributing work. There are some people that currently have the ability to take on more, and there are some people that desperately need to get rid of some of the things that they have, at least for this season. And we're being open and transparent about trying to just redistribute work within teams as best we can.
Yeah. And I think you raised a really important point on what this is, and that this isn't really remote work. I mean, we were shoved into our homes with no advance warning for the most part in many cases, where we're navigating whatever size living accommodations we have for depending on where you live in the world. Your kids aren't at school, they're home. You're a teacher, you're an employee. Perhaps you have mental health or other health issues that are exacerbated by the circumstances. Maybe you have elder care issues. I mean, this is as suboptimal as you could possibly get as it relates to not working in an office. So it'll be really interesting to actually see how this is optimized when we're beyond the pandemic and it's safe, and we're kind of in this next chapter of work. I'm incredibly excited to see what happens then, and how much is actually changed when we're able to design the spaces around us for us to be able to do our best work without all of the distractions that we're piling on top of, for many of us figuring out how to work outside of an office for the first time. So that's hugely exciting. Next question I want to jump into is from Lem Diaz, the head of people at Upbound. And his question is, aside from regular one-on-ones with managers and ensuring alignment through strong communication, what are some specific and tactical ways to maximize engagement and productivity with remote employees?
Hear about the parallel and the connection between transparency in work and belonging in culture. And all of this ties back to engagement. If you give people a single place where work happens, you reduce their mental load on them having to think, where do I have to go to understand where work is happening across the organization? That is step number one. If you don't have a tool, a centralized heartbeat of where work happens, please get one. Again, we use GitLab. There's an awesome app called Friday.app. I know some teams use Dropbox Spaces. You need to have a central repository, a central thoroughfare where all of your work is. And what we've seen is that if you set people up so that work is transparent and they're easily able to see what's going on, a lot of this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy and it kind of solves itself. People want to engage more when they're able to see more. So if you, as a leader, increase the access to information, you should see increased contributions. And if you don't, I see that as a red flag that you don't have a culture of psychological safety where you're truly encouraging people to contribute and making sure that those contributions are respected and they don't receive any backlash for that. So I would say step one, make sure the tool is in place. Step two, really monitor, do people engage with it? Because if not, it could be a signal of a deeper, more systemic issue on trust.
Okay. Next question I want to get to here is from Connie Pashala. She's the head of talent and employee experience at Blue Prism. And her question is, do you have any suggestions on how GitLab has developed managers to have the right coaching conversations? So kind of piggybacking on that last one, but also on how managers have supported their employees' mental health over the past year.
I was recently in a Future Forum conversation with Brian Elliott and the team at Slack, and they have some incredible data on how this remote transformation is impacting all levels of organizations. And the key takeaway was middle managers are getting crushed by this because you have individual contributors that are shouting to the rooftop of all the things they need to do their work well now that they're at home. And then you have executives who can kind of make things work no matter what. Like they don't necessarily have to invest a lot in this huge transformation because maybe their day-to-day is still kind of okay. So you have the middle managers in between that are trying to persuade their higher ups like, hello, this is a sea change. We should probably invest in this. And then trying to manage the emotions and workflows and realities of their direct reports. So the middle managers have it the toughest. On top of that, many of them have never been taught how to be a great remote manager. It's a hugely different task. So at GitLab, we have an amazing learning and development team that have actually been building what we're calling a manager challenge. And we're actually building curriculum on how to remotely manage. The cool thing is all of this is open source, and I'll share this here in the link. So even if you don't work at GitLab, you can take GitLab L&D. That's the absolute beauty of open source. And if you have ideas on contributing and making it better, we'd certainly welcome that. One other thing that I'll plug here is we got this question a lot early on. It was far and away the biggest question. So we ported a lot of our best knowledge on remote team management to a platform called Coursera. And so you can take a course there. It's split out over, I believe it is 5 weeks. It's free to take. There's an optional paid certificate at the end. But I actually had someone DM me on Twitter the weekend after this course went live on Coursera. And they said, I actually binged the entire thing over the weekend. And I thought, well, if we can make something compelling enough that people want to binge school, hopefully we're doing something right. So, take heart, the resources are out there.
Yeah. Yeah. And like I said, I will include the links to all the resources Darren's referencing in the show notes for those of you that are watching after the live event. Next question I want to jump to comes from Daniel. The question is, how do you manage crisis among parents, more specifically mothers, who are definitely have more of the workload other than kind of non-parent workers? Yeah.
Yes. At GitLab, we're just so good about working transparently and being having a place of psychological safety where working parents can raise their hands, or caregivers in many cases can raise their hand and say, this is no longer amenable for my current life, and we figure out a way to make it work. We're cool with cutting scope. Sometimes you got to reduce the OKRs. Like instead of trying to figure out how to be a magician and still hit the same numbers, sometimes the numbers have to change. Sometimes the work that was assigned to one person needs to be reassigned elsewhere. At this point, that's about the best you can do, because even if you were to give people a stipend for childcare in many places of the world, you can't actually get it in your home. They can't take your money even if you wanted to give it to them. So it's a very strange and interesting place right now. I hope we're one day closer today than yesterday on being on the other side of that. But I would encourage leaders to proactively plan for a post-pandemic support system for this. Childcare has always been important, and I actually appreciate the spotlight that's been placed on it through COVID. There is this silver lining in a crisis, and I do think that's one of them.
I like this next question. This is from Chris Brown in Berlin. He asked, how does, as head of remote, how does your role and scope and responsibilities overlap with the chief people officer? Like, what is that relationship like? How is that kind of coordinated? How are the responsibilities split? Like, obviously they're not in a position to be head of remote, but like, how do you work with, I guess the best way to frame that is, how do you work with your CPO?
Depending on the size, the existing remote fluency is it's the first time anyone has ever worked remote. But I will say the head of remote is the most cross-functional role in the entire company. Because the one reality you'll find is that even though your departments do different things, finance does something very different than engineering. The common thread is remote. Both of them now need perks and benefits and policies and documentation that work well in a remote setting. And so I see the head of remote as additive to what the chief people officer was already doing. And I look at it as an in-house advisor, an in-house steerer. So a great example of how I actually work with our people team in L&D. We have an amazing L&D team. They are geniuses at learning and development. So I'm not going to come in and tell them how to do L&D, but I will advise and steer and make sure that the L&D principles that they are schooled on work well across 65 countries. What are the things that they might not be thinking of that you take the inclusive lens, the remote lens? And I actually would encourage you to think about the emergence of the chief diversity officer. So if you dial back long enough, there were early conversations on, diversity, it matters. It's growing, it's big. Maybe we should put some intentionality around this. It's too big to just put it as a line item on the chief people officer. Like, hey, handle diversity and inclusion. CPOs are like, hold on, I got enough going on. Maybe we should put intentionality on this. I see this role following a very similar trajectory where companies are realizing it's complementary. We have more to consider now, and top talent will start asking questions about flexibility, that you need someone who understands the nuances of what it looks like to really advise and support the CPO as well as the CEO.
Cool. Next question here. I'm going rapid fire. I want to get as many of these in as we can.
All right, let's do it.
So pardon the bam bam bam, but people have questions for you, Darren. The next question comes from Courtney. Her question is, do you have a listening strategy in place for ensuring equitable outcomes for employees, no matter their location or work arrangement?
So clear on what success looks like, and it has to value results, not inputs. For companies that have been doing praises and promotions based on subjectivity, this is a massive change. But what you'll find is that if it all boils down to metrics, actual numbers that both sides perfectly understand, then it doesn't matter where the work happens. And I would encourage managers who are managing a newly remote team to listen carefully to feedback from direct reports who are in a remote space for the first time. If they are telling you they need tools or documentation or context or understanding to do their job well in a new space, that becomes your blueprint to the remote transformation. So managers need to be less directors of people and more unblockers, listeners to feedback. Your people will tell you what you need to do. You don't have to just guess or invent new policies that you hope work in a remote world.
Yeah, and the next question I want to get to actually is another from Len Diaz, and he asks, actually, I think this question will be relevant to a lot of viewers, because particularly is, some of the startups that are coming together and being founded in the shadow of the pandemic, last year, maybe year before, certainly this year and beyond. Many of them are choosing to go remote or distributed from the get-go, like GitLab, like some of the other pioneers that have come before them. Are there any, like, when you think about the growth obstacles for early stage startups, maybe around under 100 as they scale, are there any particular things as it relates to remote work that they need to be thinking about at that early stage before they begin that, that hyper growth and scale period?
I actually think there's going to be more opportunity than anything else.
Yeah.
It's one less thing to worry about. Imagine coming out of YC and you're like, we can spend the seed round on people, tools, and technology. We don't have to worry about office space. It's like one less huge thing you have to worry about, and it extends your runway in a massive way. But the one thing you do need to think about early is documentation. You have to document your values. You have to document your ways of working early, obnoxiously early. And what I mean by that is, you don't need to write this stuff down when it's 10 people. Everyone's around each other enough to just get it. But if you don't do it at 10, it's harder at 100.
Yeah.
It's harder at 500. And what you'll find is that documentation works much like compound interest. If you invest in something 10 years ago, there's a lot of compounding interest that happens that you can't possibly re-engineer 10 years down the road. Documentation works the same way. So before you need it, before it's obvious that you need it, make sure that you invest in it.
Yeah. I mean, look, there's a lot of analogies between that and people teams. Frankly, I think if you look at startups 5 years ago, 10 years ago, often they would just scale and grow with what they had, didn't really think about HR, didn't really think about people operations, got to triple digit employees, got to 500 employees. And they're like, oh, whoa, we're still using spreadsheets. Like, we don't have any documentation or systems or processes around how we do X, Y, or Z, or we have really bad processes because we're still working off of how we did things when we were 50 people and now we're 500. So they need to hire an experienced CPO to come in, rip all that stuff out, which is hugely disruptive to the business, and then kind of re-engineer. It's expensive. It's ugly. It's frustrating for employees. So you're seeing more companies now, because of some of those lessons and lumps that were earned then, start to think about, bringing on a head of people or a CPO earlier, putting the tools in place probably before you necessarily need them, because that you'll have that foundation to grow on. That compound interest, analogy certainly fits. So that definitely makes a lot of sense. Next question I want to jump into comes from Kendra. And Kendra asks, how has measuring performance and goals changed with remote work? So how do you keep your individual contributors, managers, and executives accountable? And I know this doesn't apply to you because GitLab obviously had been that way, but as you work with other companies that are making that shift, what's your perspective on that?
And my response to that is, how did you know they were working in the office? If it was only because you looked over there and it appeared that they were working, you had deeper problems to begin with. And I know this is boiling it all the way down, but it really just comes back to tell the person what success looks like. If you as a manager can't answer that, they definitely can't do it. So for a lot of companies, they're having to go back to the drawing board and ask themselves what success looks like. And I understand that's a very oversimplified answer, but it starts there. And then the second step is, listen to your people. If they tell you they need things or information or tools, listen to them. Get them those tools. That becomes your blueprint for what to change.
Yeah. And I mean, imagine like the amount of money companies spend on real estate, right? And offices aren't dead. There will be offices. They'll look different, and for many organizations, their use will be different in many organizations. They will exist. None of us are saying offices are dead forever. But many companies are reducing their footprint. And hopefully that is freeing up some dollars for them to be more thoughtful around how they're, as Darren said, kind of supporting some of these structures and tools and technologies that allow for optimal work in the way that we're structuring things now. Again, whether it's fully distributed, whether it's hybrid, whatever it might be, kind of now and into the near future. I really like this next question from Rachel. She kind of acknowledges you're probably, one of, if not the most interviewed person as it relates to remote work. What is one question you wish people would ask, but they never do?
Question. So the answer should be, what I wish people would ask me is, what can I do with my life if it wasn't completely dictated by a commute?
Yeah.
Like just stop and think about that. So for us, my wife and I, just over 2 years ago, we adopted a newborn at birth. It's an extraordinary way to grow your family. It's an open adoption. It's beautiful. It's the most amazing thing I've ever been a part of. Made a lot more practical because I didn't have a commute binding my Monday through Friday. So when I think about tens of millions of people working remotely, recapturing all of this time, if even 5 or 10% of them said, yeah, I'll grow my family through fostering or adopting, we would solve the orphan crisis overnight with no additional investment in infrastructure. So my question here is like, what else could we solve just by giving people time to live better lives? That's what I hope people focus on the other side of the pandemic, because the answer to that question gets real exciting really quickly.
Yeah. I like that you took that question in that direction. I think for, for so many of us, whether we live in the suburbs or the cities, commuting is a big part of our normal day to day, right? Pre-COVID day to day. And that's just time completely lost. And when you unlock that time, and are able to then think, wow, what am I going to do now? Like the ability to, we're obsessed with this idea of, whole self and HR and, all of that. Like if that is really important to us, why not give our employees more space to find that, to discover that, to lean into that? And so, yeah, that to me, I think that there will be some lasting shifts and mentality and values and needs for employees as we move beyond this. And I think that certainly is one. There's just people who, based on what they've experienced over the last year, will never go back to an office 5 days a week. They just won't, and they won't have to. And so for organizations, I know there's a lot of, people leaders watching this. If you have a CEO who's, hot to trot to get everybody back in an office, find some of these stories and examples you could bring to them of what employees really want and how some of their drivers are shifting, because it's going to be really difficult for those kinds of organizations to attract great talent, because they just, they will have lots of other blue chip offers at other companies that won't require that. So why would they do that if it's something that they personally don't want to do? And now they absolutely don't have to do. So,
and the next layer of that is your shareholders are going to start asking business continuity plans. If you fundamentally refuse to re-architect your business, you're not in a great position to weather the next crises. So at some point, it becomes a business continuity decision where you need to set up remote first practices to make sure that your business can continue to function well if everyone is gone from the office down the road.
Yeah. And I mean, I think we have to learn from this. Like, it's not if, it's when, right? It's when the next thing happens that is a massive disruption to all that we considered norms. Next question actually comes from Kate, and it's a question I actually hear a lot. So I'm curious to get your thoughts on here. What does ideal onboarding look like for remote employees? What are some things that organizations and HR and people teams specifically, need to make sure they're thinking about when they're designing onboarding?
Universally applicable as possible and uniform as possible. At GitLab, I think we have the world's most heavily documented onboarding process. We onboard people in GitLab, the tool, so they have no choice but to get to know the GitLab product and learn it. They can't onboard themselves without it. That's critical. And in fact, most of our onboarding, you can see it before you even apply to the company. We're very transparent. You can see the templates that we go through. And that helps us purify our recruiting pipeline. If people know what they're getting into, you have a better chance of someone opting into your way of working and showing up because they're very passionate about the way that you do things. The one thing I would say right now you could do, I know it's daunting to think about documenting your whole onboarding process, but it is something that you should move towards. But the concept of an onboarding buddy is a simple thing that any company could do right now. Whenever someone new joins GitLab, they're assigned an onboarding buddy. And this person is their one-on-one contact. You can ask this person as many questions as you want. And instead of wandering the virtual halls, hoping you bump into the right people, the onboarding buddy is there to set up key stakeholder meetings in your first 30, 60 days to make sure that you're spending time with the people that will accelerate and move your career forward at the company. This is a much more efficient way to do this, and it makes sure that the synchronous time you do spend in those meetings are going to be useful.
Awesome. Okay, we're getting tons more questions. We've got about 5 more minutes of time, so apologies to everyone whose questions we weren't able to cover. I'm actually going to jump around a little bit to try to make sure I'm getting some new folks on here. Let's see. Yeah, please do.
So Lisa says that we heard in the Culture Summit that many companies in New Zealand went back to the office after lockdown because they had long office leases or had invested already in an office redesign. So the question is, what changes do you think will need to happen externally to allow companies to have a virtual first approach? So this is an interesting one. The concept of sunk cost, the concept of we've got a 20-year lease on this building. We have to force people back into it so it appears that we're making use of it and not, quote unquote, wasting our money. But that is the scarcity view. That's looking at this through the lens of scarcity and not through the lens of opportunity. What I would encourage companies that are in this situation to do is think about what are the corporate sustainability projects you've always dreamed of doing, but you can't get the people out of the office so that you can actually do it. So if you have 100,000 square feet of now unnecessary office space, open up an internship center for underserved youth in the community. There are people within earshot of your office buildings that undoubtedly need a safe place to learn. This is an amazing opportunity for you to attach brand awareness to actually bolstering the community that you're in, while also giving your employees more flexibility on where they work instead of forcing them back into it. This is just one example. I know a lot of other organizations are getting rid of some of their space, and the real estate developers are converting it into apartments. So we're getting rid of office space we don't need while solving housing crises in this long list of demand of people that want to live in cities. So I would say the short answer here is look through the lens of opportunity and not scarcity. And if you're working with a leadership team that really struggles to grok that, this is going to be a time of great change. And I wouldn't expect everyone to be 100% happy at their existing org. I do think there will be some short-term attrition. And to do this well, it really requires executive sponsorship and 100% buy-in. So if you're very passionate about remote work, but you look at your leadership team and you've tried all the things, and you can just tell you're not going to turn this yacht around. There will be a lot of other companies coming out of COVID that would welcome your progressive input in accelerating their company with a more flexible workforce.
Yeah. Well, Darren, we're almost on time. I want to leave you with one last question for people leaders who are watching this and they're working with their executive teams currently to think through what their structure will be coming out of the pandemic, whether it's, co-located, hybrid, fully distributed. What advice do you have for them so that they are best positioned to have, thoughtful advice and input and steering and counsel with their executive peers?
Look, we are tracking companies that are going through this change, and many of them are building in public. They're sharing their failures. They're sharing their learnings. This is the ultimate time to do that. There are councils that are being formed. So look to your peers and ask questions, and don't assume that you or anyone else has all of the answers right now. We are very much figuring this out in real time. But what I've found is that the remote community is a very warm and welcoming one. And now is the time to lean into that and learn with the rest of the community.
Cool. Well, Darren, thanks so much for all of you live viewers. Thanks for spending an hour with us. Really appreciate it. Darren, thanks for making time for this. And again, huge thanks as well for all your contributions to the Redefining HR book and community, but really more importantly, your open source collaboration and sharing with the industry as a whole. We're all better for it. And I just want to thank you on behalf of all of my HR peers and brethren who I know have benefited from your generosity. So thanks so much.
Thanks, Lars. Thanks all for tuning in. Godspeed and be well.
Take care, everyone.